All right. Hey, everybody. This is Dr. Andy Wilczak from Wilkes University, and today we're going to talk about the history of anarchy in the United States. So pick whatever background music you think is appropriate here. I want to talk about the history of anarchy before I record a lecture on conflict theory and the ways that conflict theory explains crime, because I don't think that we do a very good job in sociology and criminology of taking the theoretical explanations that we have for why crime happens and grounding them in any kind of history, right? We tend to act like theories that we have just developed out of the clear blue sky. And in reality, these ideas that we have about why crime happens or how and why crime happens are really grounded in the historical era in which these theorists lived and the things that they were exposed to and the ways that the culture of their times discussed crime and thought about crime. History and sociology are tied together, and we don't really do enough to recognize that. And I don't think that's anywhere more evident than it is with conflict theory, because the United States has a long history of struggling with the ideas that conflict theory puts forward, and it's important for us as educators and for those of you who are students watching this as well to understand the battles that have been fought in the past before we can really move forward to think about what does conflict theory tell us about crime and how can we use the ideas that conflict theory gives us to make the world a better place. So first, let's talk a little bit about what anarchy is, okay? Anarchy is one of those terms that I think is really misunderstood. When you hear the word anarchy, typically it's used to describe something that's just completely chaotic, right? There's no rules, nobody's in charge, cats and dogs are living together, it's raining frogs, it's the end of days, it's just this waking nightmare, right? And nobody wants to live in that. I mean, hell, the reason why I'm recording this lecture for you is because we're living in times right now that very much feel like we don't know what's going to happen one day to the next. But that's not what anarchy is, okay? Anarchy is an idea that puts all of its emphasis in how government and how a society and how people in a society should live their lives. It puts all that emphasis locally. So, yeah, anarchists don't really have a lot of use for any kind of strong centralized government. So there's part of it, I guess, but that's not necessarily chaotic. What I think people also don't understand about anarchy is that true anarchists, are advocates for socialism. So anarchy is, taken together, is a type of stateless socialism. It's a political, socio-political, socioeconomic idea that argues the best state of being for humankind is this stateless socialism. So if we compare anarchy to nationalism and globalism, we can see how our geographic boundaries kind of shape our ideology, or our ideology is shaped by our boundaries, or something like that, right? So if you are a nationalist, as the United States has become very nationalistic in the last 3 years, your concerns for your fellow man end at the border, right? You care about the United States, or you care about your own country first and foremost, and the rest of the world is on their own. If you are somebody who is an advocate for globalism, then you view all nations as intertwined, all peoples as connected, that what happens on one side of the world is inevitably, invariably going to affect you in some way. If you are an anarchist, it's not that you don't care about people outside of your own community. You're really just concerned about what's happening right here and right now. What can you do for your community to make everybody comfortable, to make everybody safe, make sure that everybody has what you would consider under a socialist state to be those basic human rights, right? Enough food, enough money, enough shelter, everything. So anarchy and a communist society are very similar from the socialist aspect. Where they differ is the role of government. That in the communist countries that we have seen develop throughout the world, they have all been characterized, I think, by a strong central government. There has not been a true anarchist type of government, really, although we'll talk in a second about maybe that's not true, because there's this ongoing debate about how these two things should happen. So both of them began in Europe. Anarchy and socialism are ideas that both began in Europe, although arguably we see elements of both of them happening in England during the English Civil War in the late 1600s. But that's another story for another time. So you all know your boy Karl Marx. There he is on the left, the great boogeyman of the social sciences, of the political world, right? The man who created socialism and unleashed this all upon us. And on the right is Mikhail Bakunin, who was a contemporary of Marx, really a rival of Marx. Bakunin is widely credited as being the sort of the godfather of anarchy. Marx and Bakunin, like I said, were contemporaries. They were alive at the same time. Their works were inspired by each other. And it's not that they hated each other, but they kind of did, right? Like I've been trying to think of the best way to describe it in modern terms. And the only thing I can think of is, like, if you're a part of some type of subculture, like some kind of band scene or something, or a music scene, and you're not listening to music, or it's not a band that's really popular, and here's this other guy who's also really into this band that you like, but you low-key kind of hate that guy, that's, I think, a good way to think about Marx and Bakunin, right? Like, they're both parts of this larger European revolutionary subculture, but they didn't like each other. They were very different men in some ways. Marx was really content to sit back on the sidelines. Marx didn't really get himself directly involved as much. I mean, he started his revolutionary work as a journalist, so that put him on the front lines, kind of. But Bakunin, Mikhail Bakunin was exiled to Siberia at one point, and he lived in Siberia for a few years, and then decided he was going to escape from Siberia, and he did. He found a way to sneak out. He got on a boat to Japan. From Japan, I believe, to, I want to say, San Francisco. From San Francisco, I can't remember if he sailed all the way south around Central America or if he cut across. I think he sailed south around Central America, ended up on the East Coast, went from there to London, and then re-entered Russia from the west, almost like a bad rash, right? Like, the establishment at the time was just ready to be done with him and exiled him to what they thought was this forever prison. And then all of a sudden, here's your boy Mikhail Bakunin a few years later crashing the party again. Bakunin was involved in other revolutions that were failed launches in Europe. And while he was doing this stuff, Marx is sitting on the sidelines, just kind of Monday morning quarterbacking it, right? Like, it was a foolish idea for Bakunin to become involved in this revolution because the timing was wrong, and what a dope, and he set the whole cause back and all of this stuff. So, yeah, they were rivals. They both wanted to be right. I kind of wonder if it's not the case that they were just so very similar in personalities that they just were never going to get along. And so for both of them, I guess the tragedy of both of their lives, if you want to think about them as tragic figures, is that neither one of them lived to see their works ever really realized. They were failed revolutionaries. Their ideas weren't really launched until after they died. The one time in the world where we may have seen stuff that was kind of similar to what they were both arguing was in what's called the Paris Commune, a brief revolution that started in Paris in the late 1800s, where the city of Paris basically established its own government. And if you look at what they were doing during the Paris Commune and compare them to what Marx and Bakunin were both writing, here we see probably an actual, real, honest application of their political ideas. But like I said, they weren't around. And that's a weakness of Marx too, right? That I think we need to talk about here. We villainize, Karl Marx is demonized throughout politics because of this idea of socialism, or at least historically, he's been demonized by mainstream American politicians because of this idea of socialism. But nowhere in Marx's work does he ever actually say, this is how I want a government to be structured. He's very much a big idea guy, but he doesn't have any nuts and bolts policies or plans or infrastructure ideas or anything like that for what a Marxist government is supposed to look like, right? So he's got this big picture idea that we should all care about each other and we should take care of each other and we should not allow capitalism to control the minutia of our lives. But he never says like, hey, this is what it should look like. So from what political scientists and historians have been able to piece together, the Paris Commune seems to look the most like what Marx and Bakunin were both arguing for. So again, this idea that socialism and anarchy are polar opposites is kind of tricky, right? Like I don't know that a spectrum is the right description for it. So there is, I had forgotten that I put this in here, but there is this sense of like, yes, they're they're adversaries, right? But they're working towards the same thing, maybe actually advocating for the same position. So if you've ever gotten into like a miscommunication with somebody or an argument with something, with someone, and you realize that you're both saying the same damn thing, that might actually be a Marx and Bakunin thing. So all of these ideas were native to Europe, especially Eastern and Central Europe, and didn't come to the United States until these major waves of immigrants from Germany and from Poland and from parts of Eastern Europe started happening in the mid to late 1800s. There was all kinds of wars. Europe was really war-torn for much of the 19th century, on and off and on and off. And so that spurred a lot of immigration to the U.S. And so refugees fleeing these wars, or maybe not even refugees, just ordinary people trying to get the hell out of Dodge, come to the U.S. Fully steeped in these ideas that both Marx and Bakunin had been teaching to them, or may have been teaching a generation before. Many of these immigrants ended up in major urban centers in the United States, and many of them became the backbone of the manufacturing economy in the United States. So really, these wars and all this conflict in Europe, not only does it spark a massive immigration boom to the U.S., but it also almost kind of single-handedly creates what we think of as the labor movement in the United States today. That there, all of the unionizing, right? Everything that we think about unions that happened a century later, practically in the 1960s and 70s, all of that has its origins in this first labor, or this first immigration movement. So let's go then to the first big anarchic act in the U.S., which is the Haymarket Square riot, May 4th, 1886. So this happened in Chicago, and it was the first time since the American Civil War that Americans had killed other Americans on such a massive scale. There was this very charismatic labor speaker named Albert Parsons, who was himself a vet of the Civil War, I believe, who traveled throughout the country giving these speeches to labor unions. And at this point, the unions and the socialist movement and the anarchist movement in the United States, they're not all the same thing. If you can think of like a Venn diagram with three circles overlapping each other, that's kind of what it was, right? Not everybody who would go to an Albert Parsons speech is a socialist or a anarchist, but they are probably a labor person, but they may also be unemployed. They may be on strike. So there's a lot of overlap here. And so on this day in 1886, Parsons was brought in to give a speech. Like I said, he was part of almost like a traveling crew that was giving speeches all over the country. They had expected really large turnout that day, but it was terrible weather. And so a smaller crowd than they anticipated. Parsons goes up. He gives kind of his boilerplate speech about the importance of the working class, and he leaves and goes to a nearby like a bar, right, to hang out. The speech making continues. At some point, somebody in the police makes a call to start breaking it up. Police officers descend on the talk. There's a standoff, and somebody throws dynamite. And like we may see it, and we talk about, if I ever get around to recording stuff for all of you on sociology of revolutions, like a lot of these major revolutionary acts happen almost by accident because some anonymous person pulls a trigger or throws a rock, or in this case, throws dynamite. And so they throw the dynamite at the police. It obviously explodes. People are killed and injured. The police advance on the speakers, and basically all hell breaks loose. Parsons himself goes on the run for a little while, but eventually decides that he's going to turn himself in. There's almost a nationwide manhunt for him. Not quite to that point, but law enforcement throughout the country definitely have their eyes out for him, and it's not such that Parsons really has any place to go, right? Anybody that he would have sought refuge with is being watched already, so he's kind of stuck. And so he decides, maybe foolishly, to turn himself in, thinking that justice will prevail, that I did not have anything to do with this. I wasn't there when the dynamite was thrown, and I didn't encourage anybody to do it. And he was convicted and executed for his role in the Haymarket Square riot. And it's at this point where we see over a century of major First Amendment clashes begin between the United States federal government and different versions of organized labor throughout the country, where we see the government arguing that these organizations should be denied their constitutionally guaranteed rights to free speech and freedom of assembly, because the government would say that these people are dangerous radicals, and what they're doing is fomenting violence. They're planning violent acts against the United States, and therefore we should be allowed to punish them even if they get together, right? And that any speech coming from any labor person or socialist or anarchist is by definition almost treasonous, right? And so it's important to realize, again, framing this kind of in the sociology of revolutions work, that by definition, all government is conservative, because there is no government that wants to adopt so much reform that the nature of that government would no longer exist, right? So right now I'm recording this in March of 2020, during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. Obviously a global pandemic at this point, but we're starting to feel the crunch here. And we're looking at a presidential election, right? Where one candidate has sort of clothed himself in this language of being a revolutionary. And the fact is, if you look at this again from a social revolutions perspective, that if Bernie Sanders wins, whatever a Bernie Sanders government looks like is going to trend to be more conservative than probably what people want it to be. So this is true for the entire history of the United States. This is true for the entire history of every sort of liberal bourgeoisie government that's existed in the world, as far as I know. That by definition, the government is going to be conservative, because the government is always going to do what's best for the government first, and what keeps the government in power, and what keeps the status quo, whatever that looks like then, whatever maintains its status quo. So let's say hypothetically Bernie Sanders pulls off this victory and is the next president. It's going to feel very radically different in the early days of his presidency. But there will come a point, because there comes that point with every so-called reform candidate, reform president, that a Sanders government is going to start doing what's best for the Sanders government and less so for the American people. And we see this principle here with the history of anarchy, right? That the government is not going to say, hey, like, these guys have some really good ideas, because those ideas involve toppling the government. And so the government's perspective is going to be that, obviously, we're awesome. We're fantastic, right? We can drape ourselves in the flag and baseball and apple pie and the red, white, and blue and all of that stuff. These guys are dangerous. They're a threat to everything that we stand for, which is what you really love, right? The government can't, by definition, can't entertain ideas or adopting ideas that may be good ideas, but that threaten just the nature of what that government looks like, period. And so, speaking of, let's talk about the assassination of President William McKinley on September 14th, 1901. President McKinley is there on the right. Leon Czolgosz, his murderer, is on the left. I apologize for what I'm realizing now is a screw up on my part putting the pictures in, but I guess that's part of making this anarchic. So we'll get to it. I don't understand why we don't talk more about William McKinley. You know, when you go through public school in the United States and you learn about American history, you learn that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and you probably learn that President Kennedy was assassinated, and we talk about those days and some of the ideas around like what those administrations were about and whatever. And especially with Kennedy, like a lot of the conspiracy theories. We don't talk about McKinley. And I don't understand why. Because if you are listening to this and you're angry at me for insinuating whatever negative things I may have said about the United States at this point, you should love William McKinley, because William McKinley is almost single-handedly responsible for everything that the United States is in 2020. Like everything that you, listener, patriotic, nationalistic, American citizen, what you love about this country is because of McKinley. McKinley oversaw the transformation of the United States from being this sort of backwater, hillbilly, rebel country to a global imperialist superpower. Now, McKinley's vision wasn't really realized until after World War II, but everything was set in motion during the McKinley administration. McKinley also unchained American capitalists and set them loose on the world. And I think it's really during the McKinley administration that we saw a direct connection between the interests of big business and the interests of the American government, and those things becoming more and more entwined. It was the first election, his election in 1896 was the first election in American history where major corporations swung how the election was going to go by not only making major donations on McKinley's behalf, but also by basically blackmailing or threatening their employees to vote for him as well, arguing that if McKinley loses, that we might go out of business, and making those types of arguments. So McKinley himself, he never even went on the campaign trail. He did all of his campaigning from his house in Northeast Ohio, just outside of Cleveland. Every day, like hundreds or thousands of people would come and see him on his porch or like tromp through his house. But he never left Ohio. He let all of this money talk for him, and he won in 1896, and he won again in 1900. And so this is 14 years after the Haymarket Square bombing. The labor movement and the socialist and anarchist movements are still alive and well in the United States in spite of what happened at Haymarket. And this is where Leon Czolgosz enters into the equation. Czolgosz was a Polish national, I think a second-generation immigrant, whose family came here from Poland, like I said, ended up in southeastern Michigan, outside of Detroit. Detroit has had a large Polish enclave for a while. And Czolgosz and his family bounced around really between Detroit and Pittsburgh, basically, for much of his life. And Czolgosz, unlike his parents and his siblings, became really bitter about the state of labor in the United States. And he found his way into anarchist circles. And it's interesting because the anarchists that he was trying to run with really didn't like him. You can't really get it from his picture that I've included here. And this is the mugshot taken after he assassinated President McKinley. Czolgosz was just one of those guys that had a hard time making connections with people. He was just like an odd guy to be around. There's a story where he met a major anarchist speaker. Her name was Emma Goldman. She was one of the leaders of the movement back then. And he found out a train that she was going to be on, or that she was departing from. And he meets her at the train station, and she's got like her own bodyguards around her because she was a pretty well-known figure. And Czolgosz like rushes up to her and he introduces himself, and he's like trying to strike up a conversation with Goldman. And Goldman and her people are kind of just like rushing off to wherever they need to go, and they're like purposefully giving him the cold shoulder and like these very curt, like 1 or 2 word answers, and really just very clearly trying to give him the brush off. And Czolgosz is just persistent, right? Like trying to talk and talk and talk. And eventually, he leaves. And Emma Goldman's take on him is just that he's like this poor, like lost little boy, basically. And so Czolgosz takes it upon himself to hatch this assassination plan. He has no marching orders from Emma Goldman or anybody else in the anarchist movement. He has decided on his own that the best way to save the working people in the United States is to cut the head off of the snake. And so he starts kind of obsessing over William McKinley's travel schedule. And he decides that he's going to not encounter, he's going to find McKinley. He's going to get McKinley at a public appearance at this fair in Buffalo, New York, that McKinley is going to. And so McKinley goes to this like kind of like a state fair kind of thing in Buffalo, and he's going to be there for 3 days. And Czolgosz is like trying to stalk him and figure out the president's schedule. And eventually there's a moment where, or like a time at the fair where McKinley is going to do like a meet and greet. And so he's standing on this stage, almost like an outdoor kind of orchestra pit kind of setup. And there's a line of people to come and shake hands and meet the president. There was no real such thing as Secret Service back then. There were some private detectives and local cops there who were acting as security for McKinley, but nobody's really screening people as they go through the line or anything like that. Czolgosz is standing in line. He's got his pistol under a handkerchief, I believe. He gets to the front of the line and he shoots McKinley, I believe 3 times. He gets a few shots off, shoots him in the gut. McKinley falls down. Czolgosz is bum rushed by the other people who are there. The story of McKinley watching his assassin being beaten by this crowd. And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, like whether or not McKinley said it, but the legend is that McKinley tells them to take it easy on the kid. Basically, there's no medical facilities nearby, so they end up trying to operate on McKinley in a veterinarian's office. The thing about McKinley was that he was a big dude, and trying to find these bullets inside of him in a poorly lit vet's office with a vet just was a challenging situation. And so what ends up happening is that he initially survives being shot. At that point, Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president, and so he's got Teddy and like his other people around him in this hospital room once he's transferred to a hospital, and they think everything's good. The doctor's pretty sure that the bullet's out of him, but he's well enough that he's in good spirits, and he tells people like they can go, and he'll be back on his feet in a few days, and everything's okay. And basically, as soon as Teddy Roosevelt leaves to go on this big hunting trip, because Roosevelt was a big hunter, McKinley's wounds became gangrenous, and he died. And so at that point, Czolgosz is guilty of murder. In prison, Czolgosz has like almost immediate regret, because I think he was expecting, almost a hero's welcome for what he had done. But people are pretty pissed at him for what he did, and the anarchist movement quickly disavows him. So this flash forward now another 9 years to the bombing of the Los Angeles Times. The Times was a very conservative newspaper in California, and California was unionizing very fast. Los Angeles especially, was very close to electing their first socialist mayor. And had the LA Times not been bombed, they may have elected a socialist mayor in like 1910, 1912. I forget the exact year. So the Times was owned by a guy named Harrison Gray Otis, who was massively anti-union. He was so anti-union that he would ship for free copies of the Los Angeles Times up to San Francisco, because there was rumblings about like new unions forming in San Francisco, and Otis was so concerned about that, and his hatred for organized labor was so deep that he would send his people driving, I imagine, all night up to San Francisco to just drop bundles of the Los Angeles Times out on street corners for people to collect for free. So while Otis is doing this propaganda campaign, organized labor in the United States had taken a more violent turn itself, and there were a series of bombings happening at non-union sites throughout the country. At the time that these bombings were happening, nobody knew that it was this non-union connection to it, because they were happening in different states, in different periods of time, and even today, law enforcement is not the best at communicating across state lines, but back then it was almost an insurmountable task. So in some ways, from the labor perspective, it was almost a perfect crime. So these brothers, JJ and JB McNamara, who were big labor union guys from Indianapolis, make the call to bomb Los Angeles Times, and it turns into this massive ordeal where there is a nationwide manhunt for the bombers. People are astounded that this level of violence and mayhem could be brought to a major American media outlet. And with Harrison Gray Otis behind it as the victim, I guess, of this, one of the victims of this, certainly the wealthiest of the victims of this, he bankrolls this massive investigation, and he brings in this guy named William J. Burns, who was the most famous detective in the country at that time. They called Burns the American Sherlock Holmes. There's no contemporary equivalent of that, because we don't really have federal law enforcement celebrities. So I guess it would be like if we brought in Captain America or somebody like that. We're going to call the Avengers to help solve the coronavirus issue. Like, that's basically what happened. And so Burns launches this massive national investigation into what happened. We're going to go back because I forgot that I condensed slides. And so Burns catches the McNamaras in this really contrived kind of a way. But he goes to Indianapolis. He's convinced that it's them. He essentially kidnaps one of them, I think, and brings him back across the country to California by train. Gets the governor of California to retroactively sign these extradition papers. And then it turns into this huge, like, scandalous trial. The brothers are defended by Clarence Darrow, who's one of the most famous lawyers in American history. Darrow was, he thought, at the downturn of his career. This is before the Scopes Monkey trial, if memory serves. And Darrow himself is doing stuff that you would expect, like, a corrupt lawyer in a bad, like, legal thriller to do. He is accused of, so, like, both sides are trying to bribe the jury into voting their way. Darrow gets caught trying to do it a couple of times. His exchanges in court are pretty absurd. And as this trial is going on, Darrow is approached by a journalist whose name escapes me right now. But basically the idea that this guy brings to the defense team is that the brothers should plead guilty, but say that the conditions of the United States left them no choice but to engage in this level of violence. And that's what's important, is that there was an attempt at a legal play of self-defense to argue that the bombings and this level of violence that labor unions were beginning to participate in was really self-defense, and that it was really the fault of the capitalist status quo that this violence was happening. Now, it's not really how the trial ended up playing out. The brothers ultimately did plead guilty. Darrow came very close to being convicted himself for all of the jury tampering. What's important here, besides the lengths to which Harrison Gray Otis was willing to go to try to make sure that those responsible were punished, and Burns's investigation into what the anarchist and labor and socialist movements at the time looked like, what's really important here, like I said, is that there was an attempt to enter or to create a precedent that said these types of violence against capitalism was self-defense, because capitalism is trying to kill us all. So the last big case I want to talk to you about is Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti are two of the most internationally famous criminal defendants. Two men who were, in all probability, wrongly convicted of robbery. So I say 1920 to 1927 up there at the top of the slide because the crime that they were accused of committing happened in 1920, but the real story of them is the subsequent 7 years after they are convicted, as they are sentenced to death, and all of the appeals that happen worldwide, really, to try to give them a second trial. So Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants. This is Vanzetti here, Sacco here, and if you can see, they're handcuffed together. So this is a picture taken, I think this is the last time that they were ever together, they were in court that day. So they were both anarchists. They were both working class guys in Massachusetts, and they were accused of participating in a robbery that had gone bad. The robbery was, I believe they were accused of stealing the payroll from a shoe factory. People had put them at the scene, and the investigation into them uncovered all of this anarchist literature. And on top of the government already being biased against them because they're anarchists, there was also a tremendous amount of anti-Italian sentiments at the time. People despised Italian immigrants. And so if you're looking at the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti critically, this is like an easy open and shut case for the government, right? We hate anarchists. We hate Italians. These are two Italian anarchists who killed people. They have to die. So their trial is pretty brief. The lawyer that they are given, that the different movements that they're a part of hire for them, their lawyer is, so like if this guy conducted a trial today or tried to defend somebody in court today, he would be disbarred immediately. His defense strategy is almost psychotic. He is bouncing from one angle to the next. He's extraordinarily combative in court. He hates the judge. The judge hates them. The trial almost becomes as much about their lawyer battling with the judge as it is about him trying to defend the rights and then the lives of Sacco and Vanzetti. So like I said, the trial is very short, but the appeals go on and on and on for years and years after. Because once the story comes out about, hey, the state of Massachusetts has likely convicted these two guys who probably are innocent and did so in such a blatantly discriminatory way, because the judge of the case privately to people would talk about how this is an open and shut case, that they very clearly did it, and really aired out all of his anti-anarchist and anti-Italian biases privately. All of that stuff became public. And so what ends up happening around the world, the story becomes the USA is going to murder these two working class Italian guys because they hate working class Italian guys, not because they did anything wrong. And letters start pouring into Massachusetts from all over the world. There are organized strikes and protests happening all over the world, people desperately fighting for the freedom of Sacco and Vanzetti. And so in face of all this pressure, the governor of Massachusetts orders a investigation into the trial. But remember what I said a little while ago, that the government is always going to do what's best for the government and not what's best for the people, right? And it's a tough pill to swallow sometimes, but I'm not lying to you. And so the state of Massachusetts concludes that clearly everything's on the up and up. This trial was conducted in the utmost, with as responsible as it possibly could have. This is a pinnacle of justice. And furthermore, how dare you suggest that the great state of Massachusetts, that, this is the cradle of America. This is the cradle of American democracy. How dare you suggest that we could do anything wrong here? Kind of doubles down and becomes intransigent on their approach to Sacco and Vanzetti. And so in 1927, they are electrocuted. And that's the end of their story. So we've talked about all of this already. So this ends us with the New Deal. And then we'll branch off from here into conflict theory proper. So the New Deal was a series of economic policies orchestrated by President Franklin Roosevelt that was designed to alleviate suffering, economic suffering caused by the Great Depression. And the New Deal came about, like the seeds for the New Deal were planted during the trial of J.B. and J.J. McNamara, and the idea that there might be a legal argument to suggest that all of this violence towards capitalism can be thought of as self-defense. Like, that scared people in power. Now, again, in the social revolutions work that exists out there, we think of social change or opportunities of social change in terms of the different routes that stakeholders can take, okay? So here's a crisis. We can either go in a completely radical or revolutionary direction to try to address the crisis, or we can go in a more conservative approach or a more conservative direction. And the conservative direction is one of two other forks in the road. You either adopt a little bit of the radical stuff, or you double down on what you're doing and say, we're not the problem, you're the problem, right? That's what being intransigent means. You're being confronted with like all of the things that you're doing poorly and being like, it's not our problem, we're actually awesome, you guys are crazy. So to put this in like modern terms, if you think about climate change and how the US federal government, especially under the Trump administration, is handling climate change, they have been intransigent about it. They have said, we're not changing anything. We're not doing anything different, right? In fact, we might be doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on policies that we know, listening to this lecture, that we know created or helped contribute to the climate crisis to begin with. That's being intransigent. A progressive or a revolutionary conservative approach would be to do things like cut carbon emissions or maybe end fracking, right? Like very clear, immediate things that could be done. They're not doing that. So here, right, with the New Deal, we are presented with a case of, here is what, 40 years of violence, maybe even longer than that, right? There are ways to cut this window differently, but we'll say 40 years of political violence stemming on this issue of economic equality. And the Great Depression, the almost total collapse of the stock market, again, very similar to what's happening now. The total collapse of the stock market means everybody suffers. And if we don't do something, then these people who were violent before, when everything was seemingly going great, are going to become even more violent. And so the New Deal was a conservative approach to this change that needed to happen. It wasn't a revolution. Although today, Democrats especially like to think of FDR as this revolutionary, and the New Deal has this reputation for being this very radical and revolutionary set of policies. It really wasn't, right? Like, the Roosevelt administration did what they had to do to alleviate suffering of enough people while also staying in power, and ultimately staying in power for 4 terms, right? Had FDR just doubled down and said, we're not doing anything differently, we're living in a completely different country if that happens. And I'm not familiar with the election of Franklin Roosevelt, but I imagine that there were probably socialist candidates who would have been much more radical than anything that FDR would have created in the New Deal. So the New Deal is very much a compromise among the elite in the United States. Like, if you want to maintain some semblance of your old way of life, then you have to buy into these policies. You can complain and cry and whine as much as you want to. I don't care, as long as you ultimately play along and buy into it, right? We can keep up this theatrics of like whatever political drama, as long as you're willing to buy into what we're doing here. And it's at that point that anarchy in the United States pretty much dies off. And we'll talk, I guess, in the future about what socialism becomes. But this is really it for these ideas. The New Deal, at least from a social class perspective, killed any hope of an anarchist future in the United States. So now the question is, well, what does this have to do with how we think of crime today? Well, I ignored one part on this slide here, which is that the New Deal left out black workers in the US. The New Deal was something that really only benefited white people. And in that sense, again, we see how the New Deal was really a conservative reaction and not this revolutionary reaction. We also see the Roosevelt administration kicking a can down the road that would come back to bite the federal government some 30 years later, long after President Roosevelt is dead and gone, that creates what we think of as conflict theory today and this new generation of Marxist thought around the role of the federal government in setting crime policy and what we even think of as crime. But that's a talk for another day.